Tonight, federal agents have uncovered over $250 million in cash hidden inside the walls of a Minneapolis charity.
At 10:23 a.m., federal authorities stood before a wall of cameras inside the Hennepin County Federal Building and delivered a statement that would fundamentally reshape how America views charitable organizations forever. Over $250 million in cash had been discovered hidden inside the walls, floors, and ceilings of a Minneapolis nonprofit that had been celebrated as a beacon of hope for East African refugees. But this was not simple embezzlement. This was not accounting fraud. This was something far more sinister. What began as a routine financial audit into irregularities at a Somali American humanitarian organization evolved into the exposure of one of the most sophisticated money laundering and trafficking networks ever operated on American soil. The investigation revealed connections that stretched from the frozen streets of Minneapolis to the scorching deserts of East Africa, from legitimate banking institutions to underground hawala networks, from refugee resettlement programs to human smuggling corridors. And the man at the center of it all was not just stealing from vulnerable populations, he was trafficking them. The organization called itself the Sunrise Community Foundation. Its mission statement promised hope for the hopeless. It spoke of resettling refugees, providing job training, offering mental health services, and building bridges between cultures. Its CEO, a polished and articulate man named Farah Abdi Hassan, had become the face of Somali American success. He appeared on local news programs. He testified before city council. When he was photographed shaking hands with business leaders and receiving awards at diversity galas. His foundation received millions in federal grants meant to support at-risk youth and resettle families in violence. He drove a modest car. He wore simple suits. He projected humility at every turn. But behind that carefully constructed image was a man who had transformed charity into a criminal enterprise. And federal investigators were about to tear his empire apart piece by piece. It started at 4:17 a.m. on a Sunday morning in late January. Minneapolis was locked in the grip of a polar vortex. The temperature had dropped to 23 below zero. Wind chills made it feel closer to 40 below. The streets of the Cedar Riverside neighborhood were silent, except for the low rumble of idling vehicles and the distant howl of Arctic wind cutting between buildings. 51 FBI agents, 22 ICE officers, and 3 full SWAT teams assembled in the shadow of a 5-story brick building on the corner of Riverside Avenue. This was the headquarters of the Sunrise Community Foundation. From the outside, it looked like any other urban nonprofit, a former warehouse converted into office space, decorated with colorful murals depicting unity and progress. Inside, it was a vault of secret. The breach was surgical. Flashbangs detonated in the stairwell. Agents in tactical black swept through hallways lined with photographs of smiling refugee families and inspirational quotes about perseverance. They moved with precision, clearing room after room. Offices were secured, computers were seized, filing cabinets were tagged and cataloged. But it was on the 4th floor, inside the executive suite, where the operation took a turn that no one expected. One agent noticed something wrong with the wall behind Hassan's oak desk. The paint was slightly, the texture was newer than the surrounding surfaces. He pressed his gloved palm against it and heard a hollow echo that shouldn't have been there. Within minutes, a sledgehammer came down. The drywall crumbled, dust filled the air, and what they found inside made every person in that room stop breathing. Stacks of cash, bricks of $100 bills wrapped in plastic and industrial tape. Row after row, layer after layer, packed so tightly that some of the bills had fused together from moisture and pressure. The smell hit them immediately, that unmistakable scent of old paper, mildew, and something faintly chemical. The agents kept pulling. They tore down more walls. They found cash hidden in ceiling panels. They found it stuffed inside hollow support beams. They found it packed into fake electrical junction box and hidden behind false sections of ductwork. By the time the winter sun crept over the Minneapolis skyline, they had extracted over $22 million in U.S. currency from that single office. But that was just the beginning. While the raid team was still documenting the scene, another unit struck a second location 14 miles northwest in the suburb of Brooklyn Park. This was a residential property registered under a shell company called Northland Community Services, LLC. The house sat on 3 acres of land at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac. It looked like any other upper-middle-class home. But the moment agents breached the front door, they knew this was no ordinary resident. The entire first floor had been gutted and converted into a processing center. Industrial money counters lined the walls. Vacuum sealers and shrink-wrap machines sat on folding tables. Dozens of labeled boxes were stacked against every wall, each marked with a destination code: Nairobi, Mombasa, Dubai, Istanbul, Doha. Agents found another $28 million in that house alone. But the money was not the most disturbing discovery. In a locked safe beneath the basement floor, investigators found ledgers, handwritten logs detailing payments, names, dates, wire transfer confirmations, and a series of encrypted hard drives that would take federal cyber forensics analysts 4 days to crack. When they finally broke through the encryption, the scope of what they were looking at became horrifyingly clear. This was not just money laundering. This was the financial backbone of a transnational human trafficking network. Inside a sterile room at the FBI's Minneapolis field office, forensic accountants began mapping the trail. The numbers were staggering. Over the past 6 years, the Sunrise Community Foundation had received more than $500 million in combined funding. Federal refugee assistance grants, state social services contracts, private donations from corporations seeking tax benefits, foundation grants from well-meaning philanthropy. On paper, that money was supposed to feed the hungry, shelter the displaced, provide medical care, and offer pathways to citizenship. In reality, less than 18% of it ever reached the people it was meant to serve. The rest vanished into a labyrinth of ghost company, fake vendors, and fraudulent invoices that would make a cartel accountant envious. One line item claimed $11 million for emergency medical supplies shipped to refugee camps in Kenya. The supplies never existed. The shipping company was a shell. The warehouse listed as the origin point was a vacant lot in Gary, Indiana. Another invoice showed $9 million paid to a construction firm for building community centers across Minnesota. The centers were never built. The construction firm was registered to a deceased individual whose identity had been stolen from a nursing home in Duluth. The money did not simply disappear. It was systematically rerouted, laundered through currency exchanges in Dubai and Nairobi, wired to accounts in Turkey and Qatar, funneled into logistics networks that moved human cargo across international borders. The analysts uncovered a code name buried in the encrypted files: Operation Horizon Bridge. It was a human trafficking pipeline disguised as legitimate refugee transport. The operation worked with terrifying efficiency. Sunrise Community Foundation would identify vulnerable individuals in East African refugee camps, people desperate to reach America, families willing to pay anything for the promise of safety. The foundation would file legitimate asylum paperwork through proper channels, establishing a trail of documentation that appeared completely legal. But for every legitimate refugee case, there were 3 more that existed only on paper: ghost applicants, phantom families, people who were never resettled but whose paperwork generated federal payments. And then there were the real victims. Young women promised safe passage to America who were instead trafficked through a network of transit houses stretching from Nairobi to Istanbul to Mexico City. Young men promised jobs who were instead forced into labor or coerced into criminal operations. Children separated from families who vanished into systems designed to exploit them. The trafficking network generated an estimated $40 million annually, and every dollar flowed back to Minneapolis. Here is the part that made federal investigators realize they were dealing with something far larger than one corrupt man. Now, the money flows were too clean. The audits were too convenient. The federal oversight that should have caught this years ago was mysteriously absent. Someone with real power was protecting Farah Abdi Hassan. That someone was a woman named Commissioner Diane Hartwell, a fictional high-ranking state official who had built her career on progressive social policy and compassionate immigration reform. She had championed refugee resettlement programs. She had praised organizations like Sunrise Community Foundation in press conferences and public hearings. She had personally signed off on tens of millions in state funding without question. And according to the encrypted files found in Hassan's safe, she had received quarterly wire transfers totaling over $3 million across 4 years from accounts directly linked to the foundation. And the evidence was damning. Hartwell's digital signature appeared on documents authorizing emergency grant extensions that bypassed normal oversight. Her personal financial advisor was listed as a silent partner in 4 of the shell companies used to launder stolen funds. Her office had repeatedly blocked or delayed audits requested by federal watchdog agencies. Most damning of all, investigators found encrypted communications between Hartwell and Hassan discussing operational timelines and what they referred to as Phase 3 expansion. What was Phase 3? The answer came from a 3rd location raided that same morning: a commercial property in the industrial district of St. Paul, a former meatpacking plant that had been purchased 3 years earlier by a company called Prairie Wind Logistics. On paper, it was a distribution warehouse. In reality, it was a transit point for human cargo. When federal agents breached the facility at dawn, they found a building that had been completely retrofitted for its true purpose. The main warehouse floor had been divided into holding areas using chain-link fencing and plastic sheeting. Cots lined the walls. There were portable toilets, bulk food supplies, and medical kits. The capacity was designed for over 200 people at a time. Agents found evidence that the facility had been used recently. Discarded clothing, personal effects, food wrappers with dates from the previous week, but the building was empty. Someone had been warned. In a locked office at the rear of the facility, investigators found something that changed the scope of the investigation entirely. A computer server containing detailed records of human cargo movements. Manifests listing names, ages, countries of origin, transit routes, and final destinations. Over 4,000 individuals had passed through this single facility in the past 3 years alone. 4,000 human beings reduced to logistics data. The records showed that Phase 3 was not simply an expansion of existing operations. It was the establishment of a permanent trafficking corridor connecting East Africa to the American Midwest through a series of transit points in Turkey, Mexico, and the southern border. The network had connections to criminal organizations operating along the U.S.-Mexico border. Money from Minneapolis was flowing to smuggling operations in Sonora and Chihuahua. Payments were being made to corrupt officials in multiple countries. The trafficking pipeline was designed to be self-sustaining, generating revenue while simultaneously laundering the proceeds of the charity fraud. This was not corruption. This was infrastructure. At 5:47 a.m., the command center at FBI headquarters in Minneapolis transformed into a war room. A massive digital map covered the entire wall. Red markers pulsed across the Twin Cities metro area, across Minnesota, across Wisconsin, Iowa, and the Dakotas. Each marker represented a location tied to the Sunrise Community Foundation network. Over 1,100 federal agents were mobilized that morning. FBI, ICE, DEA, DHS, ATF, Homeland Security Investigation, U.S. Marshals, state troopers, local SWAT teams from 14 jurisdictions. Black Hawk helicopters lifted off from staging areas across the region, and armored vehicles rolled through suburban streets still dark with pre-dawn shadow. Surveillance drones circled above target locations, feeding real-time imagery to commanders coordinating the largest simultaneous law enforcement operation in Minnesota history. The raids happened with devastating precision, simultaneous strikes across 43 locations in 6 states. Agents hit apartment complexes in Minneapolis where cash couriers lived under assumed identity. They stormed storage facilities in St. Cloud filled with counterfeit documents, falsified immigration paperwork, and blank social security cards. They seized luxury vehicles registered to nonprofit board members who had no legitimate income. They raided a wire transfer business in Bloomington that had moved over $90 million to overseas accounts in the previous 18 months. In Rochester, agents discovered a second processing facility disguised as a trucking depot. In Fargo, they found a network of safe houses used to shelter trafficking victims before they were moved to their final destinations. In Des Moines, they arrested a corrupt immigration attorney who had processed over 600 fraudulent asylum applications for the network. By noon, federal agents had seized over $250 million in total assets. They confiscated $3.2 million in cryptocurrency wallets. They recovered 61 illegal firearms, including assault-style weapons. They arrested 94 individuals, including Farah Abdi Hassan, 7 members of his inner circle, 3 state employees who had accepted bribes to expedite grant approvals, 2 social workers who had falsified refugee placement reports, and a senior investigator from the state auditor's office who had been paid to bury red flags. But the biggest arrest came that evening. At 7:51 p.m., federal marshals walked into the Minnesota State Office building and took Commissioner Diane Hartwell into custody. The charges were devastating: conspiracy to commit wire, money laundering, human trafficking, racketeering, obstruction of justice, conspiracy to defraud the United States. If convicted on all counts, she faced the rest of her natural life in federal prison. The investigation did not stop with the arrests. Analysts began tracing the money backward and forward through time. They discovered that Sunrise Community Foundation was not an isolated operation. It was one node in a larger network that had established similar operations in Ohio, Michigan, and North Dakota. Each organization followed the same blueprint: apply for federal refugee assistance grant, create fake service programs with minimal documentation, skim the funds through fraudulent invoices, launder the money through shell companies and hawala networks, use a portion of the proceeds to fund human trafficking operations that generated additional revenue. The model was elegant in its corruption. Every dollar stolen generated more dollars. Every trafficking victim represented both revenue and cover for financial crimes. The legitimate refugee work provided perfect camouflage for illegal operations. Investigators estimated that the combined network had stolen over $700 million from federal programs over the past decade. It had trafficked more than 12,000 individuals through its pipeline. It had corrupted public officials in 8 states. And it had been operating in plain sight the entire time, The victims were everywhere. They were in the refugee camps, exploited by people who claimed to offer salvation. They were in the transit houses, stripped of dignity and hope. They were in American cities, trapped in labor arrangements they never agreed to, terrified to seek help from authorities they had been told would deport them. They were in communities across the Midwest, families who had trusted Sunrise Community Foundation with their most vulnerable moments, and only to discover they had been statistics in a profit calculation. The cost of this betrayal cannot be measured in dollars alone. It is measured in lives shattered, in families separated, in hope destroyed, in trust broken beyond repair. It is measured in the young woman from Mogadishu who paid everything her family had for safe passage and ended up imprisoned in a transit house in Turkey. It is measured in the elderly man from Kenya who believed he was helping his grandchildren reach America and instead funded the network that exploited them. It is measured in the honest social workers and nonprofit employees who dedicated their lives to refugee services and now face suspicion because of the actions of criminals who wore the same badges. Power does not always announce itself with violence. Sometimes it hides behind smiles and handshakes and the language of compassion. Sometimes it wears modest clothing and speaks softly at community meetings. Sometimes it calls itself a hero while it traffics the vulnerable. This story is a warning. It is a reminder that the most dangerous corruption is not the kind that arrives with obvious malice. It is the kind that builds itself from within, using our laws, our generosity, our belief that people who claim to help others deserve our trust. The individuals arrested in this operation will face justice. The systems they exploited will be reformed. The victims they harmed will receive support. But the lesson must not be forgotten. Trust must be earned, not assumed. Oversight must be vigilant, not convenient. And those who exploit the vulnerable must understand that eventually, the walls they hide behind will come down. If you are still watching this, tap like so more people see what really happened in Minneapolis. Comment expose if you believe corruption like this needs to be dragged into the light. And remember, this is a fictional dramatization, but the lessons it carries are real, because somewhere right now, someone else is filing another grant application. Someone else is building another shell company. Someone else is hiding another fortune inside walls that were meant to shelter hope. And they are counting on the world to look the other way. Do not let them.